Hi guys. So to better prepare for tomorrow's test, I wanted to create a quick tutorial to walk you through an outline example to give you information that will help you break down each part of what you should be prepared for. Remember, tomorrow on the test, you are not completing an outline. But if you have this structure in your brain, the writing of your prompt should be a lot easier. So what I did was I created a thesis. Now I want to remind you, this is not the thesis for the test tomorrow. So please do not prepare everything for the military. You're going to be examining all the different topic areas that you've looked at: military, family, government. For Euro, you'll be looking at social structure, home life, fashion, etc. But for the purposes of this, I wanted to give you an example of how to set up an outline. So my thesis is, discipline and order were important to the Roman military. Now, what I want to draw your attention to, this is my argument. Everything that I do is trying to prove this correct. If you do not focus on this as your argument and keep coming back to it, then you are doing your writing wrong. I don't care about your writing. As a writer, you shouldn't care because you're not proving your point. And as a reader, I'm not going to care because you're not trying to prove the argument that you've offered in the introduction. So make sure, think in your brain every time you do an analysis statement, you're trying to explain to me, how does your specs prove this statement correct? So for the sake of the example, the argument that I created, and remember, I will create your thesis tomorrow, so you don't have to worry about developing a thesis. But if you did, you take your thesis question and restate it as a statement of argument. My argument is, discipline and order were important to the Roman military. That's my argument that I'm trying to prove. So now, the trick of the trade, I'm going to do something weird. I'm going to skip my A statement, and I'm actually going to go down to my specs. Because remember what I told you, it's easier to create your A and analysis if you know what fact you're going to talk about first. So in this case, I have chosen a fact that I believe proves that the military showed order and discipline. My specs example, for example, sentries who fell asleep on duty could be stoned to death by their fellow soldiers. You're going to notice the period does not go at the end of the soldiers. It goes at the end of where you see the parentheses. Now I'm going to talk to you about the two types of quotes. First, many of you ask me, what is a direct quote? If you take word for word from a source and you don't change anything, that's a direct quote. You would put quotation marks where the direct quote starts and where the direct quote ends. You still put your parentheses and the period goes at the end. So keep that in consideration. You're also going to notice, even though I've paraphrased here, if it's a direct quote, you should always have embedded with, for example, for instance, as Henry Allen stated, whatever, and then give the quote. But even when it's paraphrased, what does that mean? It means that I've changed some of the words, but I kept the main idea. I still put an introduction transition. So I would put, for example, then I give my paraphrased fact. I expect you to do the same thing. This is an unbiased statement. There's no bias here. This is what it is. And it has detail to it. So it gives the reader detail. Some bad examples. The first one. Soldiers could be killed by other soldiers. That's a fact. You can't argue that. The problem is it's way too vague and has no detail to it. Be careful. I would ask the question, what soldiers? How were they killed? Why were they killed? If those questions aren't being answered, then you probably shouldn't be using it as your only fact. Also remember, sometimes your specific examples can be multiple sentences so that it makes sense, and that's okay as long as you cite everything. The other problem I have is you have to remember that when you read even textbooks or encyclopedia, the authors themselves will create supporting detail statements and analysis. You need to make sure that when you choose words from a source that you are choosing the fact and not the author's A and analysis. Just like you do in writing, so do they. So I give an example here. The Roman soldiers were brutal to their fellow soldiers when they stoned them to death. This last part of the sentence is actually a fact. Fellow soldiers when they stoned them to death. That's, they did. Their fellow soldiers stoned them. That's a fact. The problem is, though, is the beginning of this sentence. The Roman soldiers were brutal. This is an opinion statement. This is the author putting in their own bias. Anytime you use adjectives, anytime they're saying they were very powerful, that is an opinion. You cannot use that statement. Also be careful. If the bias is in the sentence and you only use the last part of it, it still makes it a biased statement. So make sure you're aware of that when you're choosing your facts. Okay, so that's my specs. This is where my focus is. So now I need to build the rest of my outline. I know you're going to say tomorrow, Ms. Barksdale, We're not making an outline, so how do I do that? Leave a blank space. Write in your fact first, and then put your A statement in. That's perfectly fine. You're going to be typing tomorrow. So your supporting detail statement is building the bridge between your thesis and your specs. I want you to notice. So I started off with discipline and order was seen in the Roman military. These words can be seen up here in the thesis. Discipline and order, Roman military. Okay? I know you're going to say to me, well, that seems really repetitive. I don't want to write like that. And I agree with you. But for the sake of making sure you're doing it right, it's better to start off basic. And as you move along in your writing, you can become more sophisticated. So this is my link to the thesis. Then in the second part, I have my link to what the fact is going to be about in the way that soldiers were treated. This is introducing it without talking about this at all. Some of you keep combining these two sentences. Don't do that. Also, do not put any information down here up into this sentence. You need to almost categorize it. If you're talking about like Romans, soldiers building, you could say like in the way that the soldiers built their roads, period. And then your fact would explain to me how they built their roads. Okay? One note though, when you transition to your B, make sure you put in a transitional word. So I wouldn't start it the same way. You would say something like, furthermore, the Romans were disciplined and ordered in the military in the way that they did their empire building. So make sure you put those transitions in for your B and C statements. Okay? So now I've built my bridge. I have my bridge for my thesis. I've introduced my fact. I've given my fact. And now I need to do what is the hardest thing to do. I need to explain how that fact proves the thesis correct. So I want to remind you, many of you keep repeating the fact down here. And I want to show you the bad example first. The Roman army was disciplined because they stoned soldiers to death, which kept order. You've used words from the thesis, and you could argue, Ms. Barksdale, I've proved my point. The problem is, though, you are using your facts and just restating the fact. It doesn't tell me how that proves discipline. If you look at my example, I say the way the Roman soldiers were disciplined made sure they followed orders and were obedient, which helped the military maintain order. By putting in this middle chunk right here, this is where I'm proving the point. I used words from my thesis, discipline, order, Roman soldiers, but by putting in making sure they followed orders, which is they shouldn't fall asleep on duty, and it made sure that they were obedient, which helped the military, you could say command if you wanted, maybe I would add those words in, maintain order. And that goes back to prove the thesis. If you fell asleep on duty, you were stoned. Soldiers are going to make darn sure that they don't fall asleep on duty. And that's how I proved it with my analysis statement. Okay? So please be careful tomorrow. Do not repeat your specs words. I don't want to hear it over and over and over again. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is your closing statement. This is what I was talking, this is what I want you to focus on. This is a restatement of the thesis idea, but not using the same words. Please do not copy your thesis and paste it down here. I changed it. I went and looked up on thesaurus.com and I found the word obedience was used, well structured. So go to thesaurus.com and look up the words discipline and order. So my closing is, overall, the Romans required obedience from their military to create a well-structured unit that was successful. I am proving that not only were they disciplined, but I also believe that they were successful. And I use the words obedience and well-structured to make that point and get it across to the reader. Okay? All right. So I wanted to put the last piece. I wanted to put it in words, and I'm going to say it as well. Something to think about. Tonight, I would also think about the words order and discipline. Remember, this doesn't always mean punishment or reward. We talked about how in the government, this can mean making sure one group does not have too much power. It can be specific jobs for their respective group. It can be traditions and practices, such as the way that the candidates ran for office that happen year after year. In the family unit, it can be routines that happen on a daily basis. The same with fashion, the same with living in the home. It can be the way the family operated economically or had the religious practices. Consider these points when you're completing your analysis, because simply saying that they are going to be punished or rewarded doesn't always work. Okay, that's my 10-minute tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know if you have any questions. And as always, don't hesitate to come see me before school if you have any questions in first and second, or during lunch if you're in my fourth block. Good luck tomorrow.